How's everybody doing today? Thank you all for being here. First off, I want to thank Chief Raymond and the Shreveport Police Department for their outstanding leadership, and their efforts on yesterday in securing the scene and working with the other agencies that are present today, local, statewide, and even out-of-state agencies, to apprehend the suspect in a responsible manner for that horrible shooting that occurred at our hospital. I also want to thank each of the agencies represented here today for the role they played in yesterday's operation. As a former military veteran, I can say that trying to identify somebody in the midst of innocent civilians and clearing out that building is extremely difficult, one of the most difficult operations that you can do, and they did it flawlessly. The Shreveport Police Department and all of these law enforcement agencies stand unified against the crime in this city, and that's exactly what we need in times like this. With all we are facing during this pandemic, patients and healthcare providers should not have to be concerned about shootings within a hospital. There is no greater time than now for us to come together as a community and make our city safe. It will take citizens and law enforcement working hand in hand for us all to get there. My heart goes out to the victims and the families that have been impacted by violent crime. Crime impacts our entire city, whether it is an isolated incident or not. Public safety continues to be my top priority, and my administration will do all we can to reduce crime in this city. SPD is working hard every day to prevent crime and protect our citizens. It is crucial that we continue to partner with law enforcement agencies represented here today to ensure public safety. At this time, I'll hand over the microphones to Chief Raymond.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning to everyone as well. Before I've prepared some notes because I could speak for a lengthy amount of time about the events yesterday, and I didn't want to get up and ramble. But I do want to start off by saying that I could very well have more than 100 law enforcement officers behind me in order to represent and to fully appreciate the response that we saw yesterday. So I would like to thank the agency heads and command staff that joined me at the podium representing some of the various agencies that assisted. At approximately 05:33 hours yesterday morning, officers received reports of a shooting at Oshner LSU Health Shreveport St. Mary Medical Center, located at 1 St. Mary Place. Police communication officers were able to provide pertinent information to responding officers, which included information that the shooter was still on scene and armed with a gun. Officers were notified that one person had been shot in the pediatric intensive care unit. A physical description was given for the suspect, and officers received further details that it was unknown if there were other victims. Over a dozen uniformed patrol officers immediately responded to the scene, and within minutes, the first officers were arriving, as were men and women of the Shreveport Fire Department. Shreveport police officers divided themselves into small elements and made entry into the building, looking for the shooter and intent on stopping the threat. A lieutenant arrived and took over command and control of the incident, asking for K-9 units and coordinating officer response. Active shooter training kicked in for members of the Shreveport Fire Department as they made their way to the victim and began treating the gunshot wound, despite having knowledge that the scene was not secure and a lethal threat was presumed to still be roaming the hospital grounds. As two teams of police officers searched the building for the shooter, other officers set up a perimeter around the 18-acre campus, notified nearby businesses to initiate lockdown procedures, and requested nearby schools be made aware of the threat. For the next several hours, we saw overwhelming support from our law enforcement partners. Officers, deputies, troopers, and agents arrived to assist in whatever manner they could. Those two teams of patrol officers who arrived moments after the call was dispatched searched the entire campus, nearly 1 million square feet, for a possible armed and violent suspect. By the time they completed their search, we had well over 100 public safety professionals involved in the manhunt for Taniel Cole. Personnel from the Shreveport Police Department, Louisiana State Police, Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office, Shreveport Fire Department, U.S. Marshals Violent Offender Task Force, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Oshner's LSU Police, Oshner's security, and staff worked as a team to ensure the safety and security of patients, employees, and visitors to the facility. Ultimately, the entire structure was cleared a second time by dozens of law enforcement officers who broke into tactical teams and meticulously cleared every corner, nook, and cranny for the suspect, additional victims, or those who may have hidden in place after hearing gunshots erupt. During the hours-long manhunt, we worked with the staff of St. Mary's to ensure the patients continued to receive health care, meals, and other services, while also ensuring the safety and security of all those in the building. I worked in the special weapons and tactics world for 14 years, and I can tell you the coordinated response, planning, and execution during yesterday's incident was second to none. The real-world operation ran more smoothly than any active shooter training event of that magnitude that I've ever participated in. I'm sure there were lessons learned, and there are always ways we can improve our response for future incidents, but I'm extremely proud of everyone involved in yesterday's event. An incident such as this one could have been much worse. In addition to recognizing the public safety response, I want to personally recognize the nurses and staff of St. Mary's, who maintained their professionalism and dedication to patient services throughout the ordeal. Nurses and staff members who faced a gun-wielding, violent criminal before immediately recovering from that emotional trauma so they could check on the well-being of their patients and others before officers were even on scene. I saw officers place ballistic vests on maintenance workers so they could insert themselves into our tactical elements and ensure officers had access to all areas of the building during the search. We were given water, food, and overwhelming support from the St. Mary's staff, and I want to say thank you. As officers were securing the building, members of the U.S. Marshal Violent Offenders Task Force, along with assisting agencies, were working on possible leads to Cole's whereabouts. As it became apparent that he had exited the property shortly after the shooting. During the investigation, we were able to determine Daniel Cole exited the hospital, kidnapped a female from a nearby parking lot in the 1800 block of Buckner Street, and forced her to drive him to a location in Monroe area before releasing her physically unharmed. I'm going to, at this time, introduce U.S. Marshal Service Enforcement Supervisor for the Western District of Louisiana, Chris Turner, to discuss the manhunt and apprehension of Daniel Cole in more detail.
First of all, I'd like to say our thoughts and prayers go out to all those victimized by Cole yesterday, the hospital staff, the patients, the heroic citizen that was shot trying to stop Cole, and his kidnap victim. And picking up where Chief Raymond left off, our task force coordinated a multi-agency rapidly developing manhunt for Cole, which involved the agencies that he previously mentioned. Once it was determined Cole committed a kidnapping and forced his victim to drive him to Monroe, we solicited help from Monroe area law enforcement agencies, and they quickly determined Cole had released his kidnapping victim and stolen another vehicle from a car dealership. We then placed lookouts throughout northeast Louisiana through State Police Troop F, coordinated through Troop G, and all area sheriff's office agencies and police agencies along the I-20 corridor and on into Mississippi, all the way through Mississippi Highway Patrol, Jackson, Mississippi area. Cole was eventually spotted on Interstate 20 east of Jackson, Mississippi by members of the Gulf Coast Regional Fugitive Task Force, one of our partner offices that's based out of Jackson, Mississippi. They conducted a surveillance operation of the vehicle until such a time they had enough undercover law enforcement units where they felt like they could safely effect a takedown of his vehicle. They effected a takedown of his vehicle just west of Meridian, Mississippi. A short vehicle pursuit ensued, at which time Cole ran multiple U.S. Marshal vehicles. He was then forced off of the road into the median, refused to exit his vehicle, and at which time task force members ported the windows on his vehicle and extricated him from the vehicle and placed him into custody. He was transported to the county jail there in Meridian and booked as a fugitive from Shreveport. Chief.
I just want to end, and certainly we'll answer some questions. I imagine there are some questions out there. And I've said it, and it's been said by all three of us that spoke this morning. But how extremely proud I am of the coordinated effort to try to explain the difficulty in having multiple agencies come together and be able to communicate and effectively clear a 1 million square foot structure. I literally saw deputies and troopers and agents that probably did not even know one another kind of getting together and saying, okay, I have a sector, who wants to go with me? And 6 or 7 people, maybe from 2 or 3 agencies, would meet up, throw on a vest, and they started searching the building. That is possible because of the training that all the law enforcement agencies in our area conduct on an annual basis. You know, the hope is that you would never have to use it operationally, but the benefit of all that training is that when it happened, when we had to go operational, we were prepared. So I'll conclude the comments at this time, and certainly if you have any questions for myself or anybody else. Yes, sir.
Chief, one of the big questions is, at least I haven't seen footage from surveillance from the hospital. Is that something you are releasing, or do they have a surveillance system?
So they have a surveillance system. Detectives were combing through it yesterday. They have a very sophisticated surveillance system, actually. But since it is still an open criminal investigation, that's not being released at this time. And I'd leave that up to the investigators as well as the U.S. Attorney's or District Attorney's Office as to when that footage would be released.
Some of the buildings may be aware of the training presentation you guys host up like at Barracks School. Tell us about that, how it played a major role in the information you guys do also.
So, you know, nationally, unfortunately, active shooter became a real threat probably a decade or so ago now, that really started focusing on active shooter events nationwide, and that law enforcement was behind the curveball. You know, previous to this type of training, tactical training was reserved for your specialized units, your SWAT teams, your special response teams, not necessarily for the patrol officer. What active shooter training or incidents taught us is that every single law enforcement officer has to be prepared to respond in a tactical manner to events of this magnitude like we saw at the hospital. And so regionally, we train all of our officers, deputies, troopers, agents to the same tactics. So the benefit of that is I can join with someone from another agency, and although I may have never worked with them before, I understand how we're going to clear the structure. I understand the basic terminology. I understand the safety that goes into that. So that's the benefit of that training. It is conducted annually by all of our agencies. And we do, from time to time, have large multi-agency training scenarios. We had one at St. Vincent Mall a couple of years ago. But again, I've never even participated in a training scenario that went as smoothly as yesterday's real-world operation.
Did I hear that the person who was shot was a civilian who was trying to stop this guy? That was the only casualty?
So, right. So my understanding, it was an innocent third party that was shot in the altercation. But I don't want to release specific details that I'm not completely accurate of. Plus, it is still being investigated.
So is that to suggest, hold on, I have a follow-up, sorry. Is that to suggest that there could have been more casualties here had the person not intervened?
Oh, yes, most definitely. In fact, as I understand it, I believe another individual was actually shot at, or a round was fired in the direction of a staff member that was not hit, thankfully. But there's no doubt that we're lucky that there were not more casualties. Anytime you have a violent person with a weapon and multiple unarmed victims, possible victims, you could have been much worse.
All right, Chief, can you please describe in the vaguest of terms of the extent of or what was exactly going on in the context? Was Cole interacting with somebody, a female, for example, or a child? Or we don't need to know exactly.
So to be brief with it and to kind of to explain it to the best of my ability at this point, it was a domestic-related incident between Cole and a family member, friend, in which he produced a weapon and began to threaten not only the intended victim, we believe to be the intended victim, but along with all the other innocent civilians and nurses and staff members at the hospital. An unknown person, we believe unknown to Cole, intervened in some manner and was shot during that process.
How does a person with a gun get into a pediatric intensive care unit during a pandemic when hospital visitation is so limited to begin with?
You know, and I can't speak specifically, but I do know, just for brevity, this is a 1 million square foot structure. Now, there are only some limited entrances to it, but I can certainly see the difficulty in trying to ensure that every single person that enters that facility, doesn't have a weapon on them. We have people that get into secure facilities on occasion with weapons, and so it's very difficult, I can imagine, for a facility that large to prevent, what could be a lethal weapon from being introduced. But I can't speak specifically as to how he got into the building or what his the reason for allowing him entrance or anything like that.
What kind of strain or overtime is involved when you have to call the captain officers?
So certainly there was some overtime involved, and I didn't mention it in my notes, but we actually had one officer in particular that is an academy instructor. She was on her way to work listening to her radio, heard the call go out, and diverted and spent half her day clearing a structure. And so I think that just goes to speak to the professionalism and the bravery of the men and women of the Shreveport Police Department, that regardless of what their job description was on this day, we were all tactical operators. So certainly there was some overtime costs, but I'm not even concerned about I'm not concerned about how much money was spent, and I know that no other agency was as well.
Are you, is there something that you can do better next time that you're thinking about, like, next time we're going to do this, maybe a potential problem with yourself?
I really can't, nothing comes to mind. Now, we're aware of some concerns, one being communication. All of our agencies don't share the same radio system, and so communication is always difficult, but we've determined ways to work around that by having a central command post, and you have leadership from each agency at that table with their personnel's radio in hand, and we're able to coordinate amongst each other. So most of the problems that you would have in a situation like this have been identified and remedied through training. And again, I'm a huge proponent of training, and I think yesterday's operation is a perfect example of that. So multiple charges. And I'm going to refer to my list so I don't misspeak. He was charged with attempted first-degree murder yesterday upon apprehension. Has a $5 million bond at this time, as I understand it. Additionally, he's going to face charges from our local agency for second-degree kidnapping, armed robbery with a firearm, and convicted felon in possession of a firearm. I believe that the Monroe Police Department is also working on charges of an additional theft of a motor vehicle. I do not know. If anybody knows, I'm not sure if the weapon's been recovered or not.
When is he going to be extradited back to Shreveport?
I'm not aware of that date either. I believe he waived extradition. Was that correct? That's the information I got yesterday, I believe. Okay.
I don't have an answer to that.
Okay. So we don't know exactly when.
How's the victim doing?
To my understanding, that the victim is recovering well, as well as a person can recover from a gunshot wound to the leg. But
Okay, guys, we're going to do one last question and then we'll wrap it up.
Will you be working with the hospital at all, talking about security going forward here? Because I don't know how many security officers they have at that moment.
Oh yeah, and no, they had security there. They have commissioned law enforcement officers that work with Oshner's and private security or unarmed security. We've always worked with them. I know the chief, and we've had ongoing conversations about things such as this. So we will continue to work with them to prevent and to be able to respond to these incidents in the future. We thank everybody for coming out this morning.